Hello, and welcome to this series of Continuity Insights Management webinar conference. Let me start that over. I'm not supposed to be probably introducing the webinar series, so I should just be introducing myself. Never mind. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar with the Continuity Insights Management Conference webinar series. My name is Suzanne Bernier, and I'm president of SB Crisis Consulting and the author of Disaster Heroes. I also happen to be a regular speaker at these conferences, and in light of this year's April conference being canceled, Continuity Insights is now offering our presentations through webinars. And today's webinar is based on the in-person presentation I was going to present to attendees at the in-person conference in April. Instead, fortunately, we now have this online version to share with you all instead. I've also taken the time before I get into the presentation of making a few adjustments, because between the time where I had originally had the time to submit this presentation a couple of months ago to now, we all know as business continuity and emergency management and crisis professionals that the industry has completely changed and things have shifted so much that I could not properly be able to talk to you all without making some adjustments to the new realities that we're living in. So I wanted to include those into the presentation as well. So based on that, I won't take any longer. We've got a lot of things to cover today. The bottom line is I wanted to share with you all, having been in the field of emergency management and crisis response specifically for over 23 years now, I wanted to share with you all how new and what kind of new era of crisis management we're in, and what different things we need to be planning for and thinking of that we weren't trained and aware of or planned for 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, even based on the cover of this slide I changed the cover slide just based on what happened over the past 3 months because of the coronavirus pandemic. Originally, this slide title was supposed to be, something catchy like "From Twitter to Terrorism and Beyond, the new era of crisis management." But then here we are today, and we've seen a lot of what's happened, and we're still awaiting to see a lot of what we're going to see happen in the future. In the meantime, already I've had to change this presentation title to what I thought would be more appropriate now from what we've seen as crisis managers, as "From Toilet Paper to Terrorism and Beyond, the new era of crisis management." And that alone, I think, speaks volumes, the title itself. And of us seeing a title like that 6 months ago would have been foreign to us, thinking, well, what is she talking about? Is this woman crazy? But now I think we all know about the toilet paper crisis and the hoarding that happened and some of the messages that had to be going out by government and different levels of officials to let people know and raise awareness and alleviate their fears of what they should be concerned about and what they needed to be concerned about and what was additionally causing crises. So let's go through all of those, but also some of the other crises that are still there that we still need to be prepared for as well. And that's really what I wanted us to go through and address during today's webinar. So we're going to get right into that now. As I mentioned, we're in a new era of emergency management. And this presentation was prepared pre-pandemic. So that had already started. And how had that started? Well, from a number of different things that we're aware of. But for those of us who've been around in the emergency management field for over 20 years, there's a lot of things that didn't exist. So this technically is a new era for a lot of us who started off old school, where we didn't have technological tools like we do now. We barely had the internet. Google did not exist. We had cell phones in big briefcases that we had to carry around to be able to communicate with everybody. And of course, now we see that that's not the case at all. And we find ourselves today in a completely different world. And I saw this quote of the day the other day, and I thought it meant so much in what we're dealing with right now. And it meant so much to the business continuity and the crisis managers out there but I wanted to share it with the audience today. Let's have a read of it. Stop saying back to normal. Instead of wanting the past back, want the future sooner. Think about what we might create instead of mourning what we have lost. Now, specifically, from a business continuity and crisis management perspective, let's think about that again. Think about what we might create instead of mourning what we have lost. And I think that's really what's going to have to stick in everybody's mind as we all work through the pandemic and look at what we need to enhance, what we need to get rid of, and what we need to start over again, or what we need to create to make a better world and a better organization within our own worlds, our communities, and our lives. Now let's look at the current top risks and threats. Now this was pre-pandemic. What was listed and identified by the top organizations in the world and through North America as the top risks and threats. Well, here they are. And you can see several of these, not all of them, but several of these didn't even exist or were not issues of concern 20 years ago for those of us who were trained 20 years ago and developed initial plans 20 years ago. If you pull out those plans now, they're meaningless, most of them, 20 years in, because of all of these new issues. So the first risk and threat, cybersecurity. Our cybersecurity risks then were so low compared to what our cybersecurity risks are now. Let's also take a look at, and we'll talk a little bit more about cybersecurity. However, in the era of what we're in now, in pandemic, we should be even more heightened and sensitive about our cybersecurity awareness. And specifically, now is the time to be reminding all of your employees about how vulnerable we are with cybersecurity, criminal activity, hacking, phishing scams. Those are huge right now. Let's be advising our employees, specifically those who are working from home now and may not be working within a community of colleagues or looking at postings necessarily regularly that can advise them of what things to be concerned about and what to be looking for. These are the new and added cybersecurity risks that we now have and face in this new environment. But we already had a number of cybersecurity risks. Let's also look at now us all turning to enhanced technological solutions, which is great, and we have to do that. And the more we can do that, the more a lot of our businesses will be able to survive and thrive throughout and after this pandemic. However, with all of these adaptations and adoptions of new technologies, that also means that there are vulnerabilities with them. We then have to make sure that with every single thing we add on, we've got plans and procedures and testing capabilities in place to make sure that those things work when others fail. And we'll talk a little bit more about cybersecurity in a second. The second item, top risks and threats identified, active intruder attacks. I don't have to convince anybody about how many active intruder attacks we were seeing before the pandemic. We unfortunately saw a horrific active intruder attack in Canada, one of the most horrific we've ever seen during the pandemic, just a month and a bit ago. And I can tell you that might not be top of mind right now because everybody is so involved in our silent threat right now, our invisible enemy right now, that intruder. However, I do want to remind everybody, mental health is a huge issue. People requiring mental health support and those not getting them, that might continue if we do not put the proper supports in place. Let our employees and our community members have access to them and be made aware of them. Because if that doesn't happen, I can pretty much guarantee we are going to see a sharp increase in active intruder and workplace violence attacks. Even though I think the mentality within businesses will be, well, we're not going to have half of our workplaces anymore, so we really don't have to plan for workplace attacks. As long as you have a workplace, you should be planning for a workplace attack. And I tell you, after what everybody is going to be going through now and for several months and the coming years, with the financial hardships, the familial hardships, the hardships of not being able to go into a workplace, the hardships of living with family all the time and having a completely different work-life balance to be able to have to deal with. The issues of trauma when your family members die or you're impacted or affected. Guaranteed there are going to be after effects that somehow are going to play into our workplace and our workplace environments as well. Let's also think about with an active intruder attack or a workplace safety issue. That changes as well in the pandemic perspective, where if now we have, and you're asking for, a bunch of employees working from within their workplace, which is now technically their home, do you have a responsibility to ensure they are not attacked and to ensure their safety and security where they are working from within their own home, which becomes technically their workplace? A lot of things to consider, and we'll talk a little bit more about active intruder attacks as we go further down into the presentation. Terrorism. Well, we've seen terrorism doesn't stop. I was recently listening to a podcast by General Colin Powell, who was concerned about people forgetting and that this pandemic may be overshadowing that terrorism still is an issue out there globally and locally, and that people need to keep planning for that and be aware of that. And more specifically now than ever, we may be more vulnerable to those terror attacks because of the vulnerable situation that the globe is in. So let's make sure that we still are aware of those. And if we have plans in place, that we make sure we go through and revise them accordingly. Severe weather events. Well, those haven't, they've been around forever. It's not like they've popped in over the last 20 years. However, I think most of us can agree in the field that they've become more severe, whether through climate change or urban sprawl or a number of different reasons. We are seeing more and more severe weather events. Because of that, we are seeing more and more failures and opportunities to be able to try to do better next time. And we'll talk about a couple of those. Keeping in mind now, severe weather doesn't stop. We are in the middle of a months-long, if not years-long pandemic. We are now going to have to look at how our plans and our staff are able to effectively respond to the upcoming flood, fire, tornado, other natural severe weather events that are going to occur with a pandemic lens. How are we going to be able to do that safely with all of the new guidelines and directions that we have? Mass protests and civil unrest. Now that was put up there before the pandemic. However, we're seeing a lot of this happen since the pandemic happened. And we're talking about protests, people protesting their right to freedom, feeling that they shouldn't have to wear a mask, that they shouldn't have to be told not to congregate in less than 5 people in an area. We just saw it over the long weekend. We are going to continue to see this. This is something that we saw several years ago progress throughout the world with financial difficulties and different protests and civil unrest going on throughout the world. We even saw it here in Canada recently, a place where we're pretty quiet. We're not really known for our civil unrest. So if it's happening here, it's happening everywhere. It's going to continue to happen. Let's make sure that we have the plans and the procedures in place to make sure that our clients are safe if and when those continue to occur. Of course, the infectious disease outbreaks. Back then, when this was a survey a couple of years ago with companies, infectious disease outbreaks fared low on the list. But you can see now that, of course, that's going to be number one for several years. But it was there. It was on the list. It's always been on our list. It's always been on our radar here at the Ontario government for at least 18 years after we dealt with a deadly epidemic of SARS, where we saw 44 people die in our city alone in a quick span of only a few weeks. And I'll talk a little bit more and share a little bit more about the findings and lessons learned from that epidemic. But we talk a little bit about how we're going to need to plan for, not just how we're going to get through this pandemic, but how we need to plan for any whatever the infectious disease outbreak, epidemic, or pandemic is next. And then reputational crises, that's more of a new one because of social media. So we'll talk a little bit more, we'll look at some examples of what reputational crises are and how to potentially avoid them so that you are not the next reputational crisis example in a crisis communications class or workshop. All right, so cybersecurity. We all know that we see cybersecurity examples of people being hacked all the time. We're seeing more of that now, so more than ever. We're seeing stories come out every day of the vulnerable being tried to be stolen their money or their ID or whatever it is from villains over the phone or online. Everybody remembers, I'm sure, the Equifax cyber attack. It happened not only in America, it happened in Canada as well. I don't know about anybody listening, but I got my letter from Equifax warning me that I was one of those that was hacked, and they were not sure what information of mine was stolen. Just recently got my free credit report online from them since. I was also not only hacked by the Canadian side, but the American side. So, but we can see what the fallout happens when something like that happens. And then they can't properly explain how it happened and what they are going to do about it. Here's a little bit of background information from a crisis communications perspective on what happened with Equifax. Was Equifax, in the end, they were kind of not upfront with this hack and their information being stolen. It ends up that it took them a couple of weeks before even revealing to people that this had happened, even though they had been made aware of it well before they had actually reached out to people. And they didn't actually reach out to anybody until they had to. They just made this post a couple of weeks later that was sort of more of a quiet acknowledgement. In the end, that didn't serve them very well, because in a not so quiet acknowledgement, this is what happened. Their CEO gets dumped. And just a message of what could ultimately happen if we don't watch ourselves. All right, and another example of what's been happening out there through cyber. We see entire communities being held hostage for ransom, having their information held hostage. And unfortunately, truthfully, most communities end up paying, even though they will be told, don't pay. Most feel that they have no choice and they can't afford to wait. And they need access to those pieces of information, and they end up paying the person that asks for that information. All right, and I am trying to forward, and somehow there has been something that is not allowing me to forward, so here we go. Here's another one. Now, a small Ontario town. This is just an example how it's not just big New Orleans or a small, more recognized city, but we've got smaller, low-key towns that are being targeted here in Canada for ransomware and are holding their computer systems as hostage as well. So we all have to think about that. And now let's see what's going on here. Okay. Now, because of technology, there seems to be a little something here that's not letting us go down the slides well. So let's try again. All right. So I showed us this one. Let's go and see if we can go to the next one. And right, cybersecurity. Here's some questions. Well, what would you do if you were hacked and your confidential files were stolen and threatened to be posted online? Would you prepare for how would you deal with that? Specifically, what would you communicate outwardly if you knew that somebody threatened you with it, they had a potential to do it, and it could potentially happen? One of the things you probably should be starting to worry about, besides looking at your system and what you can do to stop preventing it from happening or stop it as quickly as possible when it has happened, is start writing what you're going to say. Not only externally to your clients, if they get wind of it, but to your staff, because you don't want your staff to find out about it externally through the media before you do, or before they don't want to find out before they find out from you. So are you cyber secure? And I know all of your IT folks know this, but just something to ask now that the pandemic's here and we're even more vulnerable. When was the last time we tested our DR plans and our BCP plans against cyber attacks specifically? I know we're all testing them right now, against pandemic scenarios. But within this, I think it's time that we do not wait until the pandemic's over, but somehow factor in some kind of a cybersecurity attack during the actual pandemic, because we don't have time to wait until the pandemic's gone or eradicated before we start doing exercises again. And then just to keep in mind that a lot of the threats that we have can come from our own employees. And that's why it's so important right now for us to be communicating to our employees, especially because a lot of them are working from home right now. It might be easy for them to forget that that might not be a valid email to click on, and to think about what computer system they're on while they're opening that email versus their home laptop. This is a really good opportunity to remind your employees about this, especially if they're not in the office, but even if they are, just to remember where all of those different types of sources could come from. What's the major cyber risks? Well, they haven't really changed, except now we're in the middle of a pandemic risk over top of it. So these are all, the same risks that we had, having a lack of policies or procedures, failing to monitor unauthorized use. Well, even more so, that must be heightened now more than ever. Communicating and educating staff to make sure that they're aware. I could say that now you could use this definitely as a practical excuse to let people know again and educate them on what to be aware of and not to click on and not to forward, and to let IT know of anything suspicious. And then that cybersecurity testing, make sure that you're continuing to do that. And that if anybody's thinking that, oh, well, perhaps we should wait on that kind of testing till after the pandemic's over, well, then that shouldn't be, that should not be a deterrent. If anything, that should be an incentive to be able to keep on that testing during the pandemic. And then just some resources to remind people who need some help on some great guidance and documents and procedures that are already out there that they can get from these areas. So if you're in the US, there's the National Cybersecurity Alliance, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency underneath them. And then there's CISA.gov under the US's Department of Homeland Security. And then also in Canada, for those who are listening in Canada, we've got Canada's National Cybersecurity Strategy that you can find online as well. Now let's talk about terrorism. And that's something that we heard about every day. We hear about it a little bit in the news. But now that the pandemic has hit us, we don't hear about it as much. But just because we don't hear about it doesn't mean it's not there. And we know it's there. And it's now out there again still. And it will continue to be out there. And I think I might have mentioned earlier that I was sitting in on a prior webinar with General Colin Powell as the speaker. And one of the things that he had made people aware of is, let's not forget about terrorism still being around. And let's be prepared for that threat, not just at a domestic, but at an international level. So I'm not saying that we all need to be going out and now creating a bunch of terrorism plans, but we do need to not be complacent and still think about and review all of our plans, whether we did have terrorism-specific plans or not, depending on who we are and what our location was, and we thought we were a target. Let's take a look at our current plans to make sure they still make sense should another terrorist attack or activity happen that could affect our community or our organization. Workplace violence and active shooter prevention. We talked about it a little bit up on a previous slide, but let's get into that a little bit more. As I mentioned, we are going to see a lot more potentially workplace violence issues, even as we see the workplaces themselves shrink. We may very well indeed see the workplace violence issues increase. Again, I mentioned now there are different workplaces that we are looking at. The physical workplaces where people assemble together off-site, off from their home, and now new work sites that have been deemed work sites off-site, working from home. Do those become now workplaces? If they do, if violent incidents happen within the workplace, during work time? How do you deal with them? Do you deal with them? How do you address them? These are all issues that I think every employer needs to be thinking about now as we go through this pandemic and not afterwards, because it'll be too late. We are already seeing so many mental health challenges and things that are going to progress, that are going to keep people into these states of volatile situations, financially, emotionally, stability-wise, employment-wise, and otherwise. I think we really, really need to be aware of and keep doing the active shooter workplace violence planning, the prevention, the training, and the identification of potential risks and threats for workplace violence ahead of time to try to potentially mitigate before it happens. I think that's what's so key. A little bit more on that. We know now that it can happen anywhere. It happens in our schools, in our places of worship. It happens outdoors. It happens within our workplaces. It happens everywhere. It happens in every country. As we saw, it happens in our own country of Canada, a country that we always thought was more of peace than not. Also, we used to call it active shooter. Now, most of the time in Canada anyway, we like to call it more active assailant or mass attacker, because we have seen instances of it not just be a use of force by guns, the mass attacks, but also we've seen the use of machetes, even scissors. In our local downtown Toronto building, an office worker, several office workers were attacked by a worker with a pair of scissors that was used as the weapon. We all know of vehicles here in downtown Toronto and other areas across the country and the world that were used as attacks as well, attack weapons. So that's what we mean by active shooters versus active assailants and mass attackers. All right, and let's get rid of that. All right, let's go to the next slide, and my apologies for that coming in. That is the beauty of technology, but we learn to deal with it, don't we? Let's get to the next slide, and that will let us do so. Let's just hold on for a second. In the meantime, let's talk a little bit more about active attackers and active assailants. All right, as I mentioned, active shooters versus active assailants. A lot of you might have a plan that is called an active shooter plan. I'd say you might want to change that just because active shooter references specifically that there's use of gun. Meanwhile, as we've seen historically, there may very well be use of force by other means than just active shooter, i.e. guns. All right, and of course, we need to deal with how we are going to deal with workplace violence issues if and when they happen during the pandemic period, as well as after the pandemic is over. And I wanted to bring to your attention a case study that happened while it's going on now 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, of our first large-scale mass attack / workplace violence / terrorism attack that happened in San Bernardino, California in December of 2015. Some of you might remember it. 14 office workers dead, working for the County of Public Health as public health inspectors at the time. We're at an off-site location at a conference doing a training session right before the holidays. A lone gunman and his wife entered in, who happened to be an employee of theirs, shot 14 dead and injured numerous employees. Well, I had a chance to be able to meet with and work with several times the survivors and victims' family members of that brutal attack, and have taken away some valuable lessons learned from them, and am sharing them with all of you for us to think about, to help us in how we can make sure that we have the proper plans and procedures in place in case we should ever be faced with something of this magnitude ever within our own workplaces. Here's some of the San Bernardino lessons learned. Well, unlike most active and shooter attacks, San Bernardino is considered an active shooter or workplace violence, a terrorism incident, all rolled into one. HR apparently was advised of concerns about a colleague several times prior to that attack. Now, I can't say for a fact whether or not that is indeed the case, but it is something definitely to think about. And we'll think about it a little bit further down in another slide. And now let's see. The incident was a work holiday party training session at an off-site location. Now let's think about that for a second. Many of us have thought about, yeah, well, all of us know how to evacuate from our own building, where we work, and pretty much know where the phones are and where the first aid kits are and where the exits are. But, and some people might have been trained, and they actually did. They had yearly, if not more frequently, they would have evacuation training sessions within their teams, as well as workplace violence training sessions and active shooter training sessions. However, they didn't do them yet at off-site locations. And how many of you would think to do that? How many of us would think to do that? That very well may have been a challenge as well on why they were not able to effectively leave that room in time and were not familiar or as familiar with their location to be able to do so quickly enough. Would your staff know what to do in advance of an active intruder attack? Would you know how to run? If you couldn't run, how to hide, where to hide? If you couldn't run or hide, fight, how to fight? Those are some basic things that just take about an hour and a half of a key training session to begin with, to be able to at least give all of your employees some basic safety starters, to try to give them the basic knowledge to be able to help try to ensure their safety in such an attack. Here's the impact. 4.5 years later, after us doing some research, and this was with a colleague of mine, Dr. Liz Royal, who's a renowned trauma psychotherapist, who was the trauma psychotherapist for the Manchester Police Department for 10 years. Here's some lessons that we learned from San Bernardino and the importance of critical incident stress management specifically. There was a huge loss of valued employees, and specifically because a lot of them lost trust in their organization because they did not feel supported and guided from the beginning. Very important to think about. There was a community ripple effect, a huge community ripple effect. Once you've lost that number of employees, once your organization, a governmental organization, now has all of these employees who have lost trust in you, and they have families, who have friends, who now potentially have now also lost trust, or now also are implicated. They've been indirectly affected by the mental health, the financial, all of the other challenges that have been faced by those who've been directly affected and impacted by that extreme act and that loss that happened that day. And then the secondary trauma and the deaths that have occurred and continue to occur. I can tell you that there has been at least one secondary trauma, one secondary death in the form of a suicide as a direct result of this case. And you will see more of them with many more of these types of active intruder events, of active shooter events, if we do not learn how to properly take care of and provide the accurate resources to those who need them most throughout the short and long-term recovery period. There's going to be reputational damage. There has been locally for a long time, and there will continue to be as long as people feel that they were not heard, that they were not supported by their employer. And there will be litigation, and you all know that litigation lasts for years to come. As long as there is litigation, it'll be in the news, and as long as litigation is in the news, there will be some kind of reputational damage if it has anything to do with you or your organization or your community. So a lot to think about based on one example. And I wanted to share that with you based on and from the mouths of those who were directly impacted by that attack, the survivors and the bereaved family members themselves. What went wrong? Well, There's a lot of things that went wrong. Uneducated leadership, perhaps, I can't say for sure. It seemed to be because there were so many decisions that were not made. It seemed apparent that they were not sure how to make the decisions. There wasn't really a playbook at the time, and there was nobody's fault at the time. We'd never seen something as large as that. We've seen so much happen since then, but at the time it was one of the largest that we'd seen in North America. And now we have a little bit of a challenge with the slide again, so let's see if we can change that. All right. There was an apparent lack of crisis management or proactive response at the beginning or at the early stages. So the takeaway from that is how important it is to have solid crisis management plans and response plans in place, and leadership who are trained and aware of them ahead of time to know who's supposed to be doing what and when. There didn't seem to be any guidance or psychoeducation afterwards provided to anyone who was impacted or in that room that day. And if so, it seemed to be extremely slow before it happened at all. All right, now let's go to the next one. San Bernardino lessons learned. Communicating with staff, the family, and the community throughout the immediate and the long-term recovery was key, and it still is. People are still being communicated with and need to be communicated with throughout that emergency. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, let's look at some internal versus external threats. Because a lot of times when we're thinking about how to plan for, let's say, a workplace violence incident like that one, people think about, well, what should we be planning differently for an internal versus an external threat? Well, a workplace violence incident can really be caused by either, right? It's caused by either usually a current or former employee, or potentially a spouse, could be a random stranger off the street, could be either or. Either way, how we respond and how we recover would be the same. So a workplace violence incident can be caused by either someone we know, someone knows, or it could be someone we have no idea, someone randomly off the street. Either way, the response and the recovery is the same. Where the difference is in the planning stages. So, do you have the people, the plans, the programs in place to help staff identify and report their concerns or their suspicions of a colleague before things escalate? And this is to the point of what came out during the San Bernardino lessons learned, when supposedly someone was advised of concerns of a colleague and potentially not the right things were done or nothing was done. Externally, are there measures that your organization had in place or could take to further prevent outside attackers from accessing your workplace or your work employees? So think about that. Active intruder preparedness. Are there things that you're already doing now? Are there things that you could continue to do or could incorporate throughout the year and regularly to be able to make sure people are prepared? Having those active intruder drills. Raising awareness, just like I said, letting people know about the run, hide, fight, just taking them through the Department of Homeland Security's video. There are a number of different videos that have been prepared on the run, hide, fight issue that you can use to be able to raise awareness with staff, and then showing them where to evacuate and how, and the proper procedures that you've taken in place, and also letting them know that you've got the plans in place and raise awareness to them that you're prepared and you've got the plans in place. And making sure, of course, that you've got an emergency plan completely to deal with anything, including this, and that your plan identifies the people and the people are trained, and you've got a trained spokesperson in case something happens to deal with the media, all of that good stuff, that you've got an appropriate and tested and trained emergency notification system, if that makes sense, all of those good things. I also have now a little infograph that I had created for those of you, I know it's really hard to see here, but for those of you who want this, it sort of walks you through the emergency management steps from mitigation to preparedness to response to recovery. and all of the areas on what to think of when it comes to addressing active intruder incidents. So for those of you who want to have a copy of this, feel free. You can take down my email at the end of this presentation, and then I would be happy to email you a copy of that. All right, now let's get to one of the other areas of risk that is growing more and more is severe weather. We all know that. I don't have to convince anybody of that. All of you are probably planning towards that right now or are working on something that has to do with severe weather. Well, I'm just going to remind everybody of some of the key communications challenges specifically that we've been facing with a lot of these newer severe weather outage challenges that we've been facing over the last couple of years. Well, we've seen a number of extended power outages. So that's not a surprise, but think about that again, extended power outages. So not just that's a communications challenge, it's a challenge overall, because now if everybody's looking at taking everything that they do and putting it online, and now you have extended power outages, how can you do what you've now put online and made sure that it's technology based? How can you do that? Can you do that when the power is out for an extended period of time? So an additional thing to think about, not just from a communications perspective. All right, so next, you may be forced to go back to old school methods of communications. We saw people having to do that because our communications methods failed. During some of the hurricanes the last couple of years, people had to go to old school ways like ham radio technology and AM radio. It could include going door to door to notify of evacuation orders or other important life-saving information. So think about that and how you may be putting those back into your plans. Assume you'll lose primary communications for an extended period of time during a disaster. So that's something that you should go back, and if it's not already one of your assumptions in your crisis communications plans, it should be in there. You should have multiple communication backups in place in advance, obviously because of that. And again, now even more so because of the pandemic period that we're in, the extended pandemic period that we're in, the additional communications challenges and outages that we might have, including extended power outages. And then the next tip that I would encourage everybody to tell is to go back and tell your staff and your employees to go home and have a crank or solar powered radio, you know, one of those combo radio, flashlight, cell phone chargers, because we still may have texting and internet access and capability. And then if you have a landline, make sure that you also have a corded phone to be able to use that landline, because remind anybody who has a landline, if the power goes out, their cordless phone will still not work anyway. So that brings us to an example of how we had to go to old school technology when we had to, after Hurricane Irma. We had to go to ham radio in Puerto Rico. And I think some of us might remember back 25 years ago, those things were in our plans. Some of them were as like first, second backups. And now we removed them for a while, took them away completely, and then social media came in. And then we realized, wait a minute, we need to put those back into our plans. So some of you might be familiar with this fire, but there have been a lot of wildfires going on of concern every year, and we've seen them recently in Australia. We saw them recently in California. This one is the campfire in California. Here's a couple of California campfire challenges that we faced that I wanted to share with everyone as well. The 2018 California campfire challenges. So in Paradise, they had an emergency notification system. Great to have an emergency notification system. However, it was voluntary to opt in. So residents only, they only voluntarily had to sign up to receive alerts. Well, by the time that fire happened, only about a quarter of the town's residents had opted in. Well, also, cell service for both AT&T and Verizon was lost around 10:15 that morning, while the evacuation orders were issued between 8 and 1:37 that afternoon, depending on the location. So we see what that means. So what are the recommendations and the findings out of that? Well, a couple of things. You probably, if you're going to be looking at adopting or creating emergency notification systems for your communities, you probably want to make it voluntary opt-out instead of voluntarily opting in. And explaining to everybody, of course, that it's for their own safety, and perhaps even using this as an example of why you are specifically making it a system of voluntary opt-out instead of voluntary opt-in. So voluntary opt-out means that it gives them an extra opportunity to have to then contact you to tell them, no, I wish not to be, and this is the reason I wish not to be on that list. And by doing this, I am bypassing my security and acknowledging that I may not be able to be notified of an emergency when it occurs. I believe that's the best way communities can handle something like that. And then the cell first service and AT&T Verizon, well, of course, looking at other alternative issues of communications. And we looked at some of the other alternative and old school issues and ways you could potentially communicate, as well as perhaps considering audible alarms, sirens with lights. We are seeing some communities that have gone to that in different areas in the world. All right, let's look at civil unrest. Now, if I asked this question to most communities a few years ago, everybody would have probably said no, except maybe a few areas. Probably in North America, most communities, especially in Canada, and probably a lot of yours in North America would have said, no, I don't live in a hotspot for civil unrest. And now all of a sudden, I think a lot of us can say, you know what, I don't know. Or some communities can say, yes, unfortunately, I have been in a hotspot for civil unrest. And we've seen it. We've seen it before this pandemic. We've seen it after sports activities. We've seen it after political meetings. We've seen it during attacks. We've seen it a lot. And we're seeing it right now in different countries around the world, including in North America. But I'm just reminding everybody of what could happen. Protests, peaceful demonstrations are one thing. Peaceful demonstrations are one thing. Some peaceful demonstrations stay peaceful demonstrations and are needed. Unfortunately, some demonstrations, and we've seen them and will continue to see them, some demonstrations turn into violent protests, which then turn into civil unrest. I think it's important for us to realize this, acknowledge this, and be prepared for more of this to come as the uncertainty of the pandemic and all of the fallout happens, not only within our own communities, but globally around the world. And I think we should all be prepared for it. And I'm not saying all of us should have protest plans or violent demonstration plans, but I think all of us should be aware of and know if our plans would be able to respond appropriately should one happen, and be aware of it. And I think that, if anything, that should become something that's in our toolbox and our toolkit of types of scenarios to be able to train and drill on and test our current crisis communications, crisis management, and business continuity plans and procedures. As I've mentioned, we're seeing them more and more. This is a peaceful protest. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be encouraging, and we are going to be seeing more of these, but we don't know sometimes when these peaceful protests become violent protests and into then something more by no fault of these peaceful protesters who are protesting. Now, of course, that takes us into the era of infectious diseases. Like I had said before I had prepared this presentation, this pandemic had not even hit. COVID-19 had not existed, but I still had this in there because I still have been talking about infectious diseases pretty much every year since SARS hit 18 years ago in downtown Toronto. In the meantime, I had always been talking to groups about how we need to be preparing for the next big thing that would be hitting us. And well, now, unfortunately, this is it, and we are in it. But I'm not necessarily going to be talking in this section about infectious diseases. But realistically, I'm going to be talking about all of the other things that I've already been talking about that are still out there, that we're still at risk for as well, that we cannot forget about. And which is why it's even more important for us now to take those lessons learned, our SARS lessons learned, as well as the lessons we're learning now, to be able to build solid plans to deal with whatever, whether it's a pandemic or something else that's going to hit us next time. So let's talk a little bit about that. I wanted us to talk a little bit about, and I think a lot of us are getting confused in the general public about the difference between epidemic and pandemic and outbreak. And it's pretty simple to us in the field, I think, the difference, but I think that might be something that we want to remind people about in the public. It might be something to educate people on and educate our staff on, remind them about what an outbreak is. An outbreak is usually something that's localized, right? So let's say a measles outbreak within your community or within your organization, or even we saw a localized measles outbreak within one of our hockey teams here in Canada last year. So that's an outbreak. An epidemic is something where, oh no, now we see multiple outbreaks in different areas, in different pockets, usually in one area of the world, but in several different random ones, potentially. So that would be an epidemic. And so technically SARS, for example, was deemed an epidemic. And there were several outbreaks of SARS, and it was an epidemic. Now, pandemic was there were outbreaks that started, then epidemics started throughout the world, and now we have a pandemic because there are epidemics across the world in such large numbers that it is now recognized as a global pandemic. So just to break it down and just to remind everybody, measles so far has been outbreaks, SARS was an epidemic, so was Ebola an epidemic, and then what we are in now is a pandemic. And H1N1 in 2009 was a pandemic of a much milder sort, and then 1918 was a Spanish influenza epidemic, as opposed to a coronavirus epidemic and pandemic. All right, just a little for those who don't know, I thought something that might be a little bit of interest to anybody who's on the line. Did you know the word pandemic comes from the Greek pan, all, and demos, with people or population meaning pandemos, all the people. So what I wanted to clarify is we're shifting the focus. It's not just about pandemics anymore. We're seeing numerous outbreaks and epidemics continuing to happen across the world, like Zika, Ebola, MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, as I mentioned, measles, and of course, we're going to continue to see seasonal influenza epidemics as they come. So it's much more practical and feasible for us to develop infectious disease plans and policies. So please, if you're working on your new pandemic plans, I would highly recommend you change them to infectious disease plans. And reminder that for some of you right now might be in some areas where, you know, we're opening things up a bit and it's looking like we can get back to work and things are getting semi back to the new normal. But just a reminder that we've got some waves to go through here, and that this, and we all know, we're being reminded every day, so I'm not going to go on. Everybody who's listening is just as educated as I am with what everybody's saying and all the experts are saying out there. So I'm just going to remind everybody as well that we've got, you know, potentially a lot of waves to go through. I'm going to take us back to 1918. Well, not much has really changed in a way, medically wise, when we talk about what happened in 1918. And if anything, we've got a lot worse as far as having a lot more people out there, a lot less capability to potentially control the spread. Just a reminder, I used to throw this as a slide several years ago. It's so much more valid and it makes so much more sense to people now. Back then, it didn't really make sense to people because people didn't know what social distancing was, didn't really know what this meant, but this is what that means. So back in 1918, the mayor of Philadelphia made a decision and the mayor of St. Louis made one as well. And I just want to remind you, who would you rather be the mayor of? Now, the mayor of St. Louis decided almost immediately to shut things down and socially distance everybody and isolate the community. And the mayor of Philadelphia held a big parade instead and let everybody out. And you can see how the death rates rose drastically because of that decision. So even back then, that made all the difference. We're going to have to work through the waves, and this is just a reminder of that to everybody, that we're working through the waves. But as we're working through them, we need to figure out how we're going to be able to enhance all of our other plans and procedures as well, because it's not just about pandemic and working through these waves, but it's about how we're going to work through others as they come over. But some just extra HR considerations, looking at sick time and vacation time, medical leave, doctor's notes, all of these things have to be changed for the longer term now as we're going through this pandemic. You're going to have to revise your policies and procedures throughout. Look at the safety issues of working from home. And I mentioned that earlier, but not only the physical, ergonomics. If you're asking people to work from home, are they set up ergonomically to do so? As well as their mental health from home as well. The concept of work-life balance has completely changed now. Work-life balance is no longer 9 to 5 and then making sure that you shut down at the end of the day. Work-life balance may now be that you have to take care of the kids at home and work with them on their schoolwork until noon, and then go on the Zoom call from noon until 2, and then go back and work with the kids or do whatever from 2 to 4, then go back to work on a Zoom call from 6 to 8. It's whatever works for people right now. And so our work-life balance is completely different. And I think we all have to be aware of that and be comfortable with that and adapt accordingly. And of course, recognize that our employee assistance programs are out there, but might not be enough. So what are the other things that we need to do to make sure that we can provide the right resources to our staff to be able to ensure that they have the right mental health supports that they need throughout this long-term period. And of course, the privacy considerations, as you get more cases internally, which very well may happen, how you deal with the privacy of everybody who may be getting cases and how you reveal without revealing. The potential for increased workplace violence, I mentioned that, so think about that and how you would deal with that. Do you have someone on staff that can report those concerns to, that people can report their concerns to? Are they the right person? Do people feel comfortable in reporting their concerns to that right person? Because if not, there's no then put the right person in place. Some residual viruses of concern. Here's some things that are still out there. Just a reminder, we've got seasonal flu that's going to come back again in the fall season. We've got the original bird flu that's still out there. We've got measles and mumps and Ebola and MERS, and some of these are not too much of a risk for us in North America. Some of them are. I will tell you what I think is our biggest risk, and the next thing that we should all be planning for as far as infectious diseases go. I believe, and I am going to predict, it's going to be measles. Why is it going to be measles? There are going to be a lot of people for a lot of period of time who are not going to be vaccinating their children. They're not going to be seeing their medical practitioners as ordinary. They're not going to be going to the hospitals to get their kids vaccinated. What's going to be happening? We're going to be seeing a lot more measles outbreaks in the future. We were already seeing them as well. Now let's go to now some SARS lessons learned. As I mentioned, we had some SARS, we had a SARS epidemic and 44 SARS deaths in Toronto alone. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details, but we had more than 8,000 cases and nearly 800 deaths in the world. But 44 were specifically here in Toronto. It was a smaller and much quicker timeline. I'm not going to go into this. I just wanted to toss this up there to show you how quickly that timeline was. SARS was also a coronavirus, but it was an epidemic, not to the scale of a pandemic. It was infectious mostly during the height of signs. It did not have much asymptomatic spread, which was the big difference between that coronavirus and this one. So you'll see the timelines in a way here were kind of similar to ours, what we saw once it hit North America. But this was back in 2003. So we saw patient 0 first come home to Canada on February 28th of that year. Then they fell ill and died. Then they had a couple family members fall ill. And then we had some health practitioners fall ill from it. And then the Canadian researcher, a couple of months later, who identified the virus, fell ill. Then there was a travel advisory about a month and a bit later for people not entering into Toronto. And then in June, we had the last outbreak of SARS reported. And this was without any kind of vaccine or anything created at all. And then by 2005, it was officially eradicated. In the end, they were working on a vaccine, but actually there never was a vaccine in the end created. There was not a need for it. Unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing with the coronavirus that we're on right now, or that we're in right now, sorry. We are not seeing this. We are seeing something much more severe than that one. But I do want to remind you, what do I think we are at most risk for as communities? I think we're at most risk for another measles outbreak, as people are not going to take their children for vaccinations or up-to-date vaccinations, as the anti-vax movement has been becoming larger and larger. We've already been seeing the cases increase. I believe we are going to see that more and more so, and that's why we as practitioners need to make sure that we have the right infectious disease plans in place to make sure that we can deal with these these measles outbreaks that are happening. Like I said, we are seeing already the largest outbreaks in 20 plus years in North America for measles. We're seeing them across North America. We've got a record number of cases that were reported in 2019. That's the greatest number since we thought it was eradicated in 2000. So the bottom line, urging anyone born in or after 1970 to make sure you've received the measles vaccine. Now, let's go into how contagious it is. It's highly contagious, even more contagious than what we're dealing with now, because a carrier typically infects 12 to 18 others who are unvaccinated, and 6 to 7 who are partially vaccinated. By comparison, a person with the flu infects 1 to 3 others. That's how bad it is. And that's what I think our next infectious disease threat is for you in your community or your organization. So let's be prepared for it. And here's how you can get prepared for it. Our lessons learned from both the epidemic and the pandemic. COVID-19 has really challenges our previous pandemic planning assumptions, that's for sure. We always had planned for, and I think everybody in the community over the last 17 years, we had always assumed for, our plan said vaccine availability within 1 to 2 years. Well, now we're seeing we may not ever have a vaccine availability for this coronavirus. So that is now tossing away that assumption that we've always had. The other assumption, we kind of never really thought about. We sort of thought about how we would implement social distancing measures, but we never really thought about whether or not people we just assumed they would accept them. We never really thought about what would happen and how we would deal with resistance and blatant and sometimes violent resistance of our social distancing measures. The other lessons learned, asymptomatic spread. We're seeing a lot of asymptomatic people who throughout the whole illness, they may have it and show no signs, or they may show no signs for several days leading up to their illness, which is of serious concern and is something else, is a severe lessons learned that we have to adapt accordingly now as well, which has now also changed our whole view on masks, which before our whole view has flipped. Before we used to say, no, masks are kind of like they're giving people a false sense of security because it's giving them the sense that it's making them safer, and it's usually about the person who's sick. That remains true. But now we've realized, because we have so many asymptomatic people out there, we want to encourage everybody to wear the mask, not because we think it's going to prevent you from getting it, but because we think that maybe if you have it and you don't even know you have it, if you wear a mask, you won't give it to somebody else unwittingly. And I think that is the biggest challenge, is as long as we can continue to convince and communicate that to people, then people will be more accepting of wearing the masks. Because now I believe people are still having a hard time arguing with people saying, listen, I'm not coughing, I'm not sick, I don't need a mask. It's not about that. It's about that you might not have any of that stuff, but you may still get somebody else sick. So those are issues that we never really had to think about before, but now we have to think about and incorporate into our plans, perhaps going forward as well. Crisis communications, again, still key. We're using social media. We have to incorporate those into our plans now more than ever. People now are self-reporting as opposed to the opposite, where we would report out and people would hear the news. Now people are telling us what the news is. So we need to be able to respond effectively. Just a reminder, There are more people in the world, I think, that have a toothbrush now than actually, there are more people now that own a cell phone than own a toothbrush. I hope that everybody listening owns both of those. But speaking of toothbrushes, just a reminder, on social media, once you have something out there, you can't put the toothpaste back in, so watch your fingers. Everybody remembers that emergency alert that mistakenly went out in Hawaii about the potential nuclear alert that went out, and then the missile alert then had to be retracted in very creative forms several minutes later after the panicky public were advised of that false alert. Again, some of our challenges with technology. It happened here in Canada a couple of months ago as well, where we had a false alert go out due to a technological and human error, where we had a mass alert go out saying that there was a failure in possible release of our nuclear generating station. I can tell you after that, everybody within a 10-kilometer radius of Toronto knew exactly where they lived from the nuclear generating plant after that. So just some issues about watching how you release things because it's hard to take things back in. Here's a tweet that was released by FEMA, and just to throw a little bit of humor in today's times for you all as we start ending off this presentation. Just reminding people to, again, watch what you tweet as well, because even as you take something away, it's still out there and might have been screenshotted and or retweeted to the world to see. So this is what FEMA Region 4 helpfully tweeted out after Hurricane Irma. Seems very helpful. Hashtag Florida, if your roof was damaged due to Hurricane Irma, and then they give the Operation Blue Roof 1-800 number. Seems pretty innocent enough. However, unfortunately, and here's where I especially watch when you're typing in numbers, because it's so easy, right, to type in the wrong numbers. And sometimes the difference in one number can make the entire difference, because unfortunately, David, a follower, finds out and he tries to call the number to get help and then realizes, oh, it was 888. It was supposed to be 1-888, not 1-800. And this was the tweet that came back. So unfortunately, you don't want that to be tweeted out, and you don't want then this to become the headline the next day, which is exactly what became the headline for FEMA the next day, instead of what it should have been, which was FEMA did a great job and wants you to know the hotline for how to get help, instead of FEMA releases a sex hotline number, which I mean is pretty funny now, and it wasn't didn't create any harm, and they corrected it right away. But I thought I'd use that as a little bit of an example, and of course an example of how you can delete a tweet, but it can already be tweeted and retweeted, and can also be screenshot and recaptured and held on to for the rest of your life, as can anything else, as a reminder, that you tweet or type or say electronically. So as a reminder, don't put anything in an email or a voicemail or a message or a text that you wouldn't want anybody to read or say or publish anywhere online or on TV or in a newspaper, is the bottom line. And that segues into the area, finally, of reputation and corporate reputation. And how your reputation can get damaged nowadays by a single event. I mean, that's always been the case, but even more so now. Your reputation can get damaged by a single tweet or by a single picture. Now that we have social media, when something bad happens, a reminder, you've got three choices. You can let it define you, let it strengthen you, let it destroy you. Let's take a look at how it destroyed and strengthened and destroyed, strengthened, or helped others. So here's a leader that we had. Some of you might recognize him. And unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. But this was our leader, our mayor of Toronto, several years ago, a mayor of Toronto, Canada. Unfortunately, I'm putting these these images up because of how serious they were at the time. He was mayor of Toronto, and how quickly they turned into a crisis communications issue and scandal for the city of Toronto and the specific leader at the time. And this was all due to the fact that one person had a video cell phone, a cell phone with video capability, where they were secretly filming and recording the mayor at the time doing what was seen as illegal activity without his permission, and then was threatened with releasing that for an amount of money, and then the video was released to the public and sold to newspapers and ultimately released. I'm not sure any newspapers actually bought and paid for, but the video was eventually released to the public. And of course, no leader wants to, and no community wants to be known to be the community around the world, to have that story go viral around the world. But it did. And I just want to put this up as a cautionary tale because this was my city of Toronto. This was my mayor at the time. And not only did I have to travel the world, and was very unfortunate to hear everybody would say to me, as soon as if I didn't know them, ask me where I was from. And as soon as I would say Toronto, they would say, oh, Rob Ford. And a very disheartening to see how, but a good example of seeing how one man's actions depicted in one short video clip, taken and shared online with one person, and then shared around the world, could then impact the reputation and the character of one community around the world for so long. Not only his own, but all of ours. So that's just to caution you all to not go down, and remind all of your leaders, not just your community leaders, not just your politicians, but your CEOs, your directors, your employees. Remind them all that we are all living in a state now where everybody has an opportunity to be eye reporters and will be able to catch you at your most vulnerable times without your awareness. So be aware of that, and try not to have this happen to your community or your company, because your reputation really can be ruined by what you do in 1 minute as opposed to 1 hour now, thanks to social media. We saw it happen during the United Airlines issue when the passenger was being dragged out of the doctor was being dragged off the plane because someone had a camera and can videotape it. And that became the face of United Airlines, as opposed to the inset image there, the CEO, who instead, we didn't really see him much at all, because when he did come and make a message, it wasn't a very sincere one, and it wasn't a very nice one. And so people just kept replaying and replaying that one image of this doctor being dragged off of United. And for 7 days straight, he became the face of United, as opposed to the United Airlines CEO of the time instead, who should have been the positive face of United Airlines. So just an example again of doing the right thing and showing up on camera and being a good, kind, effective spokesperson will do well for you, instead of making the other person the spokesperson who's having the crisis instead, and turning your crisis into an opportunity. Asking yourself how you want to be viewed after this crisis. Ask yourself that right now. During this crisis, how do you want you to be seen after this is all over? What do you want people thinking about your response? Whether or not it's directly impacting you or not, are there things that you can be doing better for others? And how can you be doing that right now and communicating that later and using that as an advantage? And as you're communicating to people, just a reminder, be first at it and be right and be credible, and that's how you're going to gain trust in your people and in your clients. By being accurate with your information, sharing with people what you know as soon as you know it, that gains you credibility. Showing that you're empathetic, that you care about them, and that you're open with them and honest with them, that builds trust. Having credibility and trust within your staff and your clients, that's going to ensure that you successfully communicate to them, and that they listen to you, and that they hear you. Turn your crisis into an opportunity. You hear this language a lot now. I've been saying it for a long time. Turn your crisis into an opportunity to build back better. Like I said, how do you want to be viewed when this is over? Pros and cons of social media. Remember, when you do those evacuation drills, remind everybody, exit that building before tweeting about it, because that becomes a crisis in itself. Remind everybody, put away the phone when you're doing those evacuation procedures. Just another issue. If you're using social media, know that you can be hacked, but know that just as quickly as you can be hacked, you can also let people know that you were hacked and fix it. Yes, people can take away your Twitter account, or you can tweet something by mistake, but don't worry about it, because you can then turn it into a joke, like the lesson that Red Cross had. You know, we didn't have much time, but I'm going to go through it quickly. The American Red Cross mistakenly, the person who was handling their Twitter account mistakenly tweeted out personal tweet on a Friday night saying they were going out to get some beer. Well, accidentally, they realized they did it on the American Red Cross official account. They caught it right away, made a little bit of a funny about it, saying they weren't actually getting slizzard. It wasn't, you know, their apologies about using the Red Cross account. And all of a sudden, they made another funny about it. And then they had so many followers from it, and they got so many followings from it, that Dogfish Fed's Beer, the brewery that she had originally mistakenly tweeted about, donated a bunch of money to the Red Cross. That's how it all worked out in the end. But another cautionary tale for everybody, and we're going to see this more and more as we see the coronavirus happening as well, all those rumors about how you cure it and everything. Just a reminder to everybody. This is supposed to say Abraham Lincoln next to it, so it's not as effective, but just a little funny there for you again. Now, and remember, to everybody who doesn't have a social media strategy right now, if you don't have one already, include it in your crisis communications plan. Now is the time more than ever to do that, when you've got everybody on social media talking about coronavirus right now. If you don't have a social media strategy, have it. What should it have in it? What's your organization trying to achieve through social media? What level of organization, to what level you're going to engage in social media? You're going to engage by monitoring only what's being said about you. You're going to monitor and respond to certain posts. You're going to go to level 3 and then monitor and respond to all posts. Are you going to activate and deactivate? Are you going to decide in advance what organizations or posts you will or you won't respond to? All of those kinds of things. Include your employees in the plan. Include them. Make sure that they follow all of your social media accounts and encourage them to retweet and reshare whatever it is that you post, because they are going to be the ones that help you. Make sure that you also, even though everybody right now is in the middle of this pandemic, I know that you're thinking, well, we don't need to run and exercise now because we're in the middle of a pandemic. Yes, you are. But there are still certain things that you need to exercise during this pandemic, like your social media strategy, like your crisis communications plan, like other things that might happen during this pandemic. So it's really still important to have those exercises. And it's so important to reach out to those resources. I didn't list many of them because all of you, I know, have been bombarded with so many great resources out there. You're familiar with the go to your local government authorities, go to your federal government authorities, your state government, your municipal, and if you're in Canada, your provincial level government authorities. There's so many great resources out there. There's also the National Center for Disaster Preparedness that's doing incredible work out there and have great resources, not only on how to use social media, not only on coronavirus, but on everything that you ever needed to know about emergency management, as well as crisis management and communications. So I'd encourage you all to go there, and encourage you all, as you're developing, as you're going back in, dealing with this coronavirus pandemic, and then building those new plans, think all the time about how you can build back better. Here's some ways to build back better. Think about changing that work-life balance concept now, opening it up even more. Thinking about and creating effective mental health strategies, effective employee assistance programs, and enhancing them to make sure that you're providing the right assistance and follow-up to people. Including the right staffing solutions, maybe including retirees, including training others who are not critical, maybe making better use of current staff. HR policies and procedures, revising for them for the short and long term, and maybe forever, for them to make better sense in a better working environment. Remote work and technology, how we can use that more effectively and better. But with all of that comes along creating other plans to make sure now that we've got backups to support these new technological things that we're adding in. The tactical spacing, I like to use the word tactical spacing as opposed to social distancing when we look at how we're going to rebuild back our office spaces that we need to, for those who need to get back in office space environments, looking at how you're going to tactically space better and staff better accordingly, and getting away from the whole open concept, shared spaces, shared offices, shared desks, shared everything. We're going to have to get away of all of that, and how we're all crammed into a picnic table area, and that's going to have to stop now. So it's all about technical spacing for those areas that we need them. And then, of course, the enhanced cleaning, that's going to become a norm now. That's going to become part of the OHS policies and procedures as well. And then the restroom enhancements, ensuring that all of our restrooms have enough soap all the time, have enough warm water, that we're not only running cold water for our clients. We need warm water to encourage people to be able to comfortably wash their hands for 20 seconds. Also have sanitizer stations put out in those places where you don't have access to soap and water, not within our washrooms, but outside of our washrooms. Because the best way still to prevent the spread is you want to encourage people to wash their hands with soap and water. In summary, we should all go back now while we're in the height of this pandemic and through the waves, not only to think about how we get through these waves, but how we're going to get through anything that we need to right now and in the future. So look back at our crisis management, all our business continuity, our current infectious disease, or if we call them pandemic plans, our crisis communications plans, and our social media strategy to make sure that we can respond to all of these new and emerging risks. If you don't already have one, have a social media component to add to these plans as well, to make sure that you can use those as an opportunity to turn this crisis into that opportunity to build back better and to get your message out that you are building back better and ensuring a safer community for your staff and your clients. On that note, I want to thank you all for all you do for your communities, your clients, your employees. Keep heroing on, keep wearing a face mask, and tactically spacing, and please help stop the spread and spread the word. Thank you very much. For those of you who have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can link me in. I have a LinkedIn profile that you can find me at Suzanne Bernier. You can also find me on my website. I have my email there. For those of you who want a copy, as I mentioned earlier, of that info chart that talks about progressing through what to think about in planning for an active intruder attack, feel free to email me. If I can help you in any way, producing or testing or evaluating any of those plans, or training you at all online or in person in the future when we can all do so safely, then I look forward to. Thank you very much again for all you do, and stay safe.